This is a story, the story of the railway worker and his songs. Before we start the story and the songs, however, here is Mr. G.E. Lighty, chairman of the Railway Labor Executives Association, speaking for the 23 standard railway labor organizations.
The Railway Labor Executives Association, in cooperation with the Radio Department of the UAW AFL-CIO, is happy to bring you the following program about railroad workers and their music, as broadcast originally on the Guy Nunn Eye-Opener program. Here is the start of the story.
I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day. I've been working on the railroad.
This is the story, the music of the American Railroad Man. Part 1, the beginning, the building.
In the beginning, there was nothing, not a mile of track. But there was a nation, still new, growing, reaching, looking west and looking east, waiting to be united.
Who were these railroad men? These men who united a nation.
First, as in everything, there were the dreamers, the pioneers, the men who saw railroads where other men saw only wilderness.
John Fitch, Oliver Evans, John Stevens.
John Fitch died broken-hearted in 1798 because his work had met with public indifference. By 1804, Evans was predicting that carriages propelled by steam would someday travel 15 miles an hour, 300 miles a day. The United States Congress thought him a maniac. Stevens, receiving no sympathy or help in his railroad ideas, built in 1820 a narrow-gauge railroad on his own estate and a small steam locomotive to run on it.
Could this have been the beginning, the inspiration for the Wabash Cannonball?
Now listen to her rumble, now listen to her go, as she echoes down the valley and flies along the shore. Now hear the engines whistle, it's a mighty lonesome call, as we ride the bars and the empty cars on the Wabash Cannonball. From the waves of the Atlantic to the wild Pacific shore, from the coast of California to snowbound Labrador, there's a train of fancy layout that's well known to us all. It's the hobo's home when he wants to roam, it's the Wabash Cannonball. Now listen to her rumble, now listen to her roar, as she echoes down the valley and flies along the shore. Now hear the engines whistle, it's a mighty lonesome call, as they drive the bars and the empty cars of the Wabash Cannonball. There's lots of places farther that you can go to see. St. Paul and Kansas City, Des Moines and Kankakee, the lakes of Minnehaha where the laughing waters fall. We reach them by no other than the Wabash Cannonball. Now listen to her rumble, now listen to her roar, as she echoes down the valley and flies along the shore. Now hear the engines whistle, it's a mighty lonesome call, as we ride the bars and the empty cars on the Wabash Cannonball. For years I've ridden on this line across the countryside. I've always been well treated, though I took the hobo's ride. And when my days are over and the curtains round me fall, please ship me off to heaven on the Wabash Cannonball. Now listen to the
Then the day of the dreamer was over, and the day of the builder began. Who were these builders? Honest men? Some. Speculators, greedy men, profit-hungry men? More often than not. But they were there, and the time for building the railroads had come.
And who did the work? Who gave the sweat, the muscle, the will? Who swung the first hammer? Who lifted the first shovel? Who laid the first track, paving the way for the other railroad men to follow?
In the East, they built the Erie in the 1840s. The majority of the workers were the Irish. There was famine in their native land, and they'd come to this new land for food. And with a heavy contingent of Germans, they built the Erie. The food they got wasn't very good. They were paid 75 cents a day. We know that they worked none too contentedly, but they built the railroad.
Billy-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 a-working on the railway. In 1841, I put me corduroy breeches on, I put me corduroy breeches on to work upon the railway. Billy-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 to work upon the railway. In 1842, I left the old world for the new. I coursed the luck that brought me through to work upon the railway. Billy-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 to work upon the railway. To work upon the railway. In 1843 was then I met Miss Biddy McGee. An elegant wife she's been to me while working on the railway. Billy-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 while working on the railway. Billy-me-oo, 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 Billy-me-oo-ree, 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 Billy-me-oo-ree-oo-ree-I-ree-ay. In 1847, sweet Biddy McGee, she went to heaven. If she left one child, she left 11 to work upon the railway. Billy-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 to work upon the railway. Billy-me-oo, Billy-me-oo, Billy-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, to work upon the railway. In 1848, I learned to take my whiskey straight. It's an elegant drink that can't be made for working on the railway. Billy-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 for working on the railway. Billy-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 for working on the railway.
That was in the East. Others worked and built in the South. Negroes did the grueling labor, some as free men, others drove the steel while they wore the steel of the chain gangs. They sang as they worked, songs of pain, of despair, of loneliness.
Take this hammer, carry it to the cabin, tell my son, come home, son. Son, come on home. That old letter read about dying. My tears run down, Lord. My tears run down. Take this hammer, give it to the captain. Tell him I'm leaving. Tell him I'm gone. Just tell him I'm leaving. Tell him I'm gone.
This has been part one of the story, the music, of the American Railroad Man. The beginning, the building.
I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day. I've been working on the
Railroad Worker and His Songs. This is part 2 of the program about railway workers and their music, brought to you by the Railway Labor Executives Association in cooperation with the Guinan Eye-Opener program prepared by the Radio Department of the International Union, UAW.
Fill-a-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 a-working on the railway. In 1841, I put me corduroy breeches on, I put me corduroy breeches on to work upon the railway. Fill-a-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 to work upon the railway. In 1842, I left the old world for the new. I coursed the luck that brought me through to work upon the railway. Fill-a-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 to work upon the railway. To work upon the railway. In 1843 was then I met Miss Biddy McGee, an elegant wife she's been to me, while working on the railway. Fill-a-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 while working on the railway. In 1847, sweet Biddy McGee, she went to heaven. If she left one child, she left 11 to work upon the railway. Fill-a-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 to work upon the railway. Fill-a-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, to work upon the railway. In 1848, I learned to take my whiskey straight. It's an elegant drink that can't be made for working on the railway. Fill-a-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 for working on the railway. Fill-a-me-oo-ree-I-ree-ay, 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 for working on the railway.
This is the story, the music of the American Railroad Man, Part 2, The Building.
They built fighting the desert, the mountains, the Indians, the miles, the never-ending miles. Here, the East was truly meeting the West, for much of the labor was coolie labor, wretched, starving Chinese, brought to this land with the promise of a new and a better life.
The railroad worker found only the burning sun, the bitter cold, the brutal policies of the railroad managements.
In the wastelands, many gave their lives for something they could not understand and would never see. Those who survived drifted to the fringes of American cities, unwanted, despised. After all, they were needed no longer. The railroad was built.
And while the coolie, flooding out from Sacramento, built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Irish were laying track toward him from the east. Paddy had already finished the Erie, had done his fighting and dying in the Great Civil War, and now was building toward destiny and that place in the Rocky Mountains of Utah where the track, the nation, was forever joined.
And like the Negro, he sang as he worked. He sang with the man beside him. He sang with all of the men around him. He sang that none must be a loafer, that none must tarry.
Drill, ye terriers, drill. It's a work all day for the sugar in your tay. Down along the railway, and drill, ye terriers, drill. Every morning at 7 o'clock, there's 20 terriers a-working at the rock, and the boss comes along and he says, keep still, and come down heavy with the cast iron drill, and drill, ye terriers, drill. And drill, ye terriers, drill. It's a work all day for the sugar in your tay. Down along the railway, and drill, ye terriers, drill, and blast and fire. Big Jim Goff was the foreman of our crew, and a rougher, tougher man I never knew. One day last week when a blast went off, a mile in the air went Big Jim Goff. And drill, ye terriers, drill. And drill, ye terriers, drill. It's a work all day for the sugar in your tay. Down along the railway, and drill, ye terriers, drill. And blast and fire. And drill, ye terriers, drill. Well, the next time payday comes around, Jim Goff $1 short was found. When he asked what for, came this reply: your dot for the time you were up in the sky. And drill, ye terriers, drill. And drill, ye terriers, drill. It's a work all day for the sugar in your tay. Down along the railway, and drill, ye terriers, drill. And blast and fire.
Many of the railroad men died where they had worked, along the line, along the track. No loved ones beside them, no kin to comfort them. Only the sound of the train whistles, as they called them, those lonesome whistles. They all heard them as they lived. So many heard them as they died.
Oh, bury me out in the sand, beside the track on railroad land, where I can hear each train go by, where lonesome whistles never die. I know I'll ride the rails no more, the promised land I'm heading for. Sidetrack my train and cool the steam. Now lonesome whistles make me dream. Oh, bury me out in the sand, beside the track on railroad land, where I can hear each train go by.
their lonesome whistles. Never die.
This has been part 2 of the story, the music of the American railroad man, the building.